So it's my pleasure to introduce for this venue Tyler VanderWeele, who's the John Loeb and Francis Lehman Loeb Professor of Epidemiology in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at Harvard at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He's also co-director of Harvard University's Initiative on Health, Religion, and Spirituality, and the director of the Human Flourishing Program. And so he's emerged as a key voice in these studies, this amazing project that the Global Flourishing Study represents. And so without taking any more of his time, so Dr. VanderWeele.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Bill and Vic, for hosting us all here during this time, and thank you all for coming today. I will be making some remarks on human flourishing, and I think this presentation will hopefully be a nice complement to Bill Hathaway's in the last session. I will be starting fairly broadly on notions of flourishing that are relatively generic and I think pertain, I would argue, across cultures. I will then move on to discuss the distinctive role of religious communities to human flourishing, and I'll conclude with just a few brief remarks on distinctively Christian notions of flourishing and point to some of our ongoing work on that. So I won't go into quite as much depth as Bill did on those final questions and points on Christian flourishing, but much of what I say I think will be highly consonant with what he pointed out as well. Okay. Okay. And some of this material here is in this 2017 paper and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, some of the definitions and the framework and measure laying out, and then some of the activities to promote flourishing and institutional pathways for flourishing are in this 2020 paper, Activities for Flourishing, an Evidence-Based Guide. Along the way, I will be providing a brief introduction to the Global Flourishing Study, but as many of you know, those analyses are still underway. The paper is under review, so the majority of the results from that will have to await another presentation, but I will make a few remarks on some of what we have found. So many of our institutions aspire to grand visions of flourishing. The World Health Organization's definition of health from 1948, still in place today, is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. The discipline of economics is sometimes described as an attempt to study how agents go about maximizing their expected utility, supposedly taking into account all aspects of an agent's preferences. The discipline of positive psychology has sometimes been defined as the scientific study of the strengths that enable individuals and communities to thrive. But in practice, many of our studies, many of our discussions pertain to much narrower outcomes, simple measures of feeling happy or measures of income or a single disease state even. They miss these grand visions of flourishing. So what is flourishing? Well, turning to our dictionaries, as indeed Bill did as well, though a different selection of dictionaries in this case. The Oxford English Dictionary defines to flourish as to grow or develop in a healthy or vigorous way. The American Heritage Dictionary, to do or fare well. The etymology of the term comes from Latin, florere, to bloom, blossom, or flower. It's often the word used to translate Aristotle's eudaimonia, sometimes also translated as happiness. The working definition of flourishing we've been using at the Human Flourishing Program is that flourishing or complete human well-being is living in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. So very broad, very all-encompassing, but this is arguably what we're seeking as individuals and should be seeking as a society. As Bill also suggested, I do think the terms well-being and flourishing do have subtly different connotations, and I will be coming back to those a little bit later in my presentation. But often I do use the words, as many do, interchangeably. But again, I think there are subtle differences, which we'll get to. So I think the discipline that's come closest to capturing this in an empirical sense is that of positive psychology. Numerous conceptualizations and measures of flourishing have been proposed in the psychological well-being and the positive psychology literature, but notably absent from pretty much all of these measures and conceptualizations is any notion of physical health. And are we really fully flourishing if we're terribly ill or bedridden? Certainly we can flourish in some ways, but are we fully flourishing without physical health? Missing from not all, but many of these conceptualizations of measures is the notion of character or virtue, contrary to Plato, Aristotle, most of the Western philosophical tradition, and really philosophical, religious, cultural traditions worldwide. And so I think we need to broaden our perspective. But we might think with something so broad, can we ever form any consensus? Is it ever possible to measure something so all-encompassing? And surely notions of flourishing will vary across religious, cultural, philosophical traditions. And while I do think that is the case, while I do think well-developed notions of flourishing will vary by culture and by tradition, I also think there's a common core. I would argue that whatever else flourishing might consist of, any reasonable conception of flourishing would include the following 5 domains of human life. Not that flourishing is reducible to these 5, and I will pick that point up when we come to distinctively Christian notions of flourishing. So that flourishing is not reducible to these 5, but I think any reasonable conception of flourishing would include these 5. And these are happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Again, the argument's not that these exhaust flourishing, but that each is a part of it. I think each of these 5 domains also satisfies the following 2 criteria. Each is nearly universally desired, and we now have some empirical data on this as well. And each is its own end. It's sought for its own sake. It's not merely a means to some other end. And I think these criteria, being an end, being universally desired, might help shape some consensus around what to measure. So as a brief assessment and crude assessment of flourishing, we've taken 2 questions from each of these 5 domains, drawn principally from the existing well-being literature, questions that are in widespread use and that have had some degree of empirical validation to form conception of flourishing. The only 2 questions which were newly proposed were that on character and virtue, and while I think there's been quite a bit of good work that's been done on character assessment over the last 2 decades, there was very little in the literature that was global in nature. Often would require 20 items to assess a single character strength like courage or creativity. So worked with philosophers to develop a couple of character items based on the notion of the cardinal virtues that at the foundation of all moral virtues lie 4, prudence or practical wisdom, justice, fortitude or courage, and temperance or moderation. So these 10 questions are as followed. First, in the happiness and life satisfaction domain, how satisfied are you with life as a whole these days? Self-rated from 0, not at all satisfied, to 10, completely satisfied. And this is perhaps the most widely used question in the well-being literature. It's been used in the UK's annual survey, by the OECD, sometimes by Gallup. And it's in this year's National Interview Health Survey here in the US. We supplement that by something more about one's affective state. In general, how happy or unhappy do you usually feel? Rated from 0, extremely unhappy, to 10, extremely happy. Then in the second domain, physical and mental health, these are just standard self-reported health questions from the US General Social Survey and the World Health Organization's Mental Health Survey. In general, how would you rate your physical health, 0 to 10? How would you rate your overall mental health, 0 to 10? Third domain, meaning and purpose. First question, overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? 0, not at all worthwhile, to 10, completely worthwhile. This question is also widely used in the well-being literature. Once again, in the UK's annual survey used by the OECD, a number of cohort studies worldwide also. And then we supplement that with something more cognitive. I understand my purpose in life, self-rated from 0, strongly disagree, to 10, strongly agree. Our fourth domain, character and virtue. First question intended in some very crude way to capture practical wisdom and justice. I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. Rated from 0, not at all true of me, to 10, completely true of me. And then a second question intended, again, in some very crude way to capture fortitude and temperance. I am always able to give up some happiness now for greater happiness later. And then our final domain, close social relationships. These two questions were taken from the UK's Campaign to End Loneliness survey of short social connectedness assessments. First item, I am content with my friendships and relationships. 0 strongly disagree to 10 strongly agree, intended in some sense to get at the quantity of those relationships. And then my relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be, intended to get at the quality of those relationships. In reporting data, we usually report separately by domain because, as you'll see shortly, the dynamics can be quite different across these various domains. Sometimes we will average all 10 questions together for a crude assessment of overall flourishing, but really this should be understood as nothing more than an average of those 5 more meaningful domains. We do typically supplement these 10 questions with 2 others on financial and material stability as important means to sustain those other ends. So questions drawn from the financial well-being literature. How often do you worry about being able to meet normal monthly living expenses? 0, worry all the time. 10, do not worry at all. How often do you worry about safety, food, or housing? Again, we'll usually report this domain separately, sometimes average all 12 questions for more secure assessment of flourishing, arguably less satisfactory conceptually, since financial resources are means, not ends, but perhaps more satisfactory in practice insofar as indicating flourishing over a longer period of time. I won't bore you with the psychometric details here, but we've published a number of papers on the properties of this measure across different cultural settings. So I will be talking about research uses of this index and what we've learned from it and are embedding it in this global flourishing study. But I think it can also be has a role for kind of purposes of self-reflection, of identifying what's going well in life and what is not, areas one might want to work on and improve, changes one might want to make in life. When taken over time, one can see what is getting better and what is getting worse and what is staying relatively the same. I often try to go through these 12 questions myself at least once a quarter, and it can be eye-opening in that regard. Some of the feedback that we've had in various settings and workplace contexts have been some of the questions made me stop and think. It was pretty eye-opening to see the areas that I really need to work on. Relief that someone is asking, I want help in certain areas. Slightly caught off guard with the questions around purpose. Missing a greater purpose, need to reach out to help more and give back. One woman who took this assessment said that after months of going back and forth and thinking about purpose, she decided to commit to a volunteering activity she had been thinking about. And so I, in fact, am going to give you all an opportunity to do a little self-reflection as well. I'll just do 2 minutes of pause, of silence for you to go through the 10 questions and reflect on your own life. Won't be collecting data in this particular setting, so don't worry. But again, just a little bit of time for self-reflection. Perhaps it's allowed for a little bit of reflection and insight. So I think this can be useful at the individual level. I think it can be useful at the community level to understand, either, say, within a university or an educational context or a workplace or a city or a state or a nation, how things are going. What are the strengths and weaknesses? How are things changing over time? Who needs help? And in what ways? So even descriptively, I think this sort of information can be quite helpful and important. And we've, in fact, been collecting this flourishing data in collaboration with the American Bible Society annually within the United States with nationally representative samples to try to understand how flourishing is changing over time. Here are just 2 waves of that data from January 2020, prior to the WHO declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then 6 months later, in June 2020. In January of 2020, the average flourishing scores across these domains was about 7 out of 10, though financial and material stability considerably lower than the others. Unsurprisingly, flourishing went down during the pandemic, but interestingly, it affected these domains in different ways. Again, perhaps unsurprisingly, happiness and life satisfaction went down quite a bit, 0.7 of a point, as did mental and physical health, 0.7 of a point. A large fall in financial and material stability in June 2020 was the height of unemployment in the United States. But interestingly, some of the other domains didn't change as much. Meaning and purpose went down a bit, but not as much as those other domains. Our character assessments were pretty much level. And somewhat surprisingly, the social connectedness assessments went down a little bit, but not nearly as much as we would have anticipated. This was corroborated by other data that had suggested that loneliness went up a bit during the pandemic, but again, not as much as one would have anticipated. And it seems that while this was certainly a difficult time for some, for others it may have led to deeper investment in families, or those one was living with, or allowing connection with relatives far away. There was evidence during this time that children felt closer to their fathers than pre-pandemic. Importantly, these means do disguise variation, and the standard deviation, the variation across these domains went up. So while for some this may have led to closer social connection, for others, perhaps especially those living alone, this may have been a particularly difficult time. So we have continued to follow up the U.S. population in this manner. By January of 2021, we saw a partial recovery. By January of 2022, almost full recovery to pre-pandemic levels. But by that point, a new pattern had emerged with the data, and that concerned age. Traditional patterns of age and well-being have tended to be U-shaped, based principally on happiness and life satisfaction, with those who are younger and those who are older doing better, and those in midlife perhaps struggling with young children and aging parents and career challenges, typically reporting lower levels of well-being. What we've seen over time, and this began pre-pandemic, is that left part of the U had begun flattening. And by January of 2022, it was strictly increasing in age across all of these flourishing dimensions. Young people simply were not doing as well as they used to be. And I think this is a cause for concern, and cause with regard to questioning how are we structuring society? Are we supporting the well-being of the next generation, and what might be done? We could spend probably a whole talk just on this question, but again, simple descriptive statistics at the community or national level I think can be quite informative with regard to understanding what's taken place and possible policy implications. So we've been collecting this data in a number of different settings and workplaces with employees at Aetna, Kohler, Owens Corning, World Bank, factory workers in Mexico, Poland, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, China, group of international flight attendants. It was used with all employees of Delta Airlines not too long ago. We've embedded this measure in various cohort studies. We've been working with a number of medical and clinical settings, various universities, though haven't managed to get Harvard to fully embrace this yet, but still working on it. Various secondary schools. It was embedded in Brandon's survey of Catholic priests. And we've also made it central in the Global Flourishing Study that Byron Johnson and I have begun. So to better understand both the distribution and the determinants of disease, Baylor's Institute for Studies of Religion, Harvard's Human Flourishing Program have partnered with Gallup to launch this Global Flourishing Study. This is a study of over 200,000 individuals in 22 different countries, representing about half the world's population, with nationally representative sampling in each country, and we'll be following up this cohort of 200,000 individuals once a year for at least 5 years to try to understand how flourishing is distributed across the globe, and also what are the factors that might contribute and enhance flourishing. The first wave of this data was released in February of this year. It is an open access data resource, so anyone can make use of this data by going to the Center for Open Science website and doing a pre-registration. But with that, you have access to this data, and we hope that it's used for a variety of purposes and that it very much advances our knowledge of flourishing. We have a research team of about 40 scholars at Baylor and Harvard and friends of the program writing a series of about 100 papers on different aspects of flourishing, both how it's distributed and also how childhood experiences shape adult flourishing. So we look forward to sharing the results of this with you in due course. Nature and Springer will be releasing a special collection with all of these various papers. So for most of the results, you're going to have to wait, but I will give a very high level preview of some of what we've found. Aggregated over the 22 countries, men and women are doing pretty similarly, but it varies quite a bit across countries. In Japan, for example, women are doing considerably better than men. In Brazil, it's the reverse. Men are doing considerably better than women. So the variation across countries is itself quite interesting. Not just the United States, but now many countries show that pattern of well-being increasing with age. That holds, for example, in Argentina, in Australia, in Brazil, in many of the countries in our sample, but not all. In India and in Egypt, for example, it's essentially still U-shaped. In Spain, it's mostly U-shaped, except for the very youngest group, which is doing the worst. So you can almost see the change happening in real time as you look at comparisons across these countries. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, we've found that happiness and life satisfaction are higher in richer developed countries than poor developing countries, but the reverse is true with meaning and purpose. Meaning and purpose is reported higher in poor developing countries than richer developed countries, which leads to questions with regard to how can we carry out economic development in ways that don't compromise meaning and purpose. Social connectedness is reported higher in most countries than it is in the United States. I think this should be cause for concern here and whether we are prioritizing the right sorts of things. Unsurprisingly, given kind of the rest of the literature on this topic and the vast majority of these studies, those who are employed, educated, married, religious, report higher levels of flourishing across these various domains. So again, we will be doing much more nuanced analyses across these different aspects of well-being across all of these countries in the year and years that follow. So I want to transition now to not only how we assess flourishing and study it, but how might we promote it. And I'll begin with kind of individual level activities. I'll move more towards institutional pathways and then try to zoom out even further and think about society more generally, and then two notions of spiritual well-being and thinking about the church and our Christian community. But there's been a fair bit of work on easy-to-use, do-it-yourself activities that promote various aspects of well-being and have been tested in randomized trials in the positive psychology literature. Some examples of these that Bill also mentioned were, for example, gratitude exercises 3 times a week. Write down 3 things you're grateful for and why. Do this for 6 weeks. And studies have found that those who practice gratitude versus writing about some neutral event 6 months later have higher levels of happiness, lower levels of depressive symptoms, higher quality sleep, fewer self-reported health symptoms, and so on and so forth. Another example is acts of kindness. For 6 weeks, pick one day and carry out 5 acts of kindness you wouldn't otherwise do. And it takes quite a bit of planning to get all 5 in a single day, but the research suggests that's more powerful than spreading them out over the course of the week. But people who do this, again, show higher levels of happiness, greater sense of flow, greater sense of social connectedness as well. Another example is use of character strengths. There are character strengths assessments and the values and action scale, for example. You can go to their website, and out of 24 character strengths, they'll tell you your top 5. And the activity is use each of those 5 in a new way each day for a week. Those who do that versus some neutral activity, again, higher levels of happiness, lower levels of depressive symptoms, even 6 months later. There are various other resources that I think can be used not just to promote happiness, but to deal with distress. book and workbook resources to try to address depression and anxiety and anger through Worthington's REACH model and forgiveness workbook, which we together have just completed a randomized trial showing effects not just on promoting forgiveness, but also reducing depression, anxiety, improving flourishing. So you can download those from Ev's website or get the personal summary from him later during this conference. So these and various other activities for flourishing are summarized in this evidence-based guide, which you can download from the Human Flourishing Program website. We do also have a flourishing app, which implements some of these, but again, most of these can be done really on one's own. Interestingly, most of these randomized trials have shown effects either on happiness or on health, and far fewer effects on these other domains of flourishing, on purpose, on character, on relationships. Interventions that have tried to change purpose and meaning have mostly been unsuccessful. Many of those studies aren't even published because they haven't found any sorts of effects. And I think for these other aspects of flourishing, it is more difficult, more challenging to change them. And I think to enhance these other aspects of flourishing, we need not only individual activities, but longer-term commitments to communities, to relationships. And so I'm going to focus on those more communal or institutional pathways to flourishing now as well. I'll be approaching this from the perspective of my own discipline, public health, and typically we think of the public health impact of an exposure or phenomena as a function of two things. Its prevalence, how common it is in the population, and the size of its effects on the outcomes that we care about. Something that is common and has large effects is going to shape population health. So if we use this lens for physical health, we're led to phenomena like activities like exercise, nutrition, not smoking, sleep. But if we broaden our lens and ask what's common in the population and has effects not just on physical health, but also on happiness, on mental health, on meaning, on character, on our relationships, the list looks rather different. And based on a review of the more rigorous studies in the empirical literature restricted to either randomized trials or strong observational studies with longitudinal designs, I would propose 4. And these are family, work, education, and religious community. Evidence in the empirical literature that each of these is common, both in the United States and globally, and that each has important effects on those various domains of flourishing. The argument's not that these 4 are exhaustive. There could be other activities that are really powerfully help promote flourishing for some individuals. Maybe deep engagement in the arts, for example, could affect all those flourishing domains, but such deep engagement is perhaps less common in the population. But in any case, the argument's not that these are exhaustive, nor that all 4 are necessary. One can flourish in the absence or one of more of these pathways. Rather, the argument is that each of these pathways powerfully affects flourishing, and if we were to make individual and community or policy efforts to promote these pathways, population flourishing would be enhanced. Won't bore you too much with the methodologic details, but this review, which was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, was restricted to more rigorous designs, either longitudinal designs with control for baseline outcome or experimental or quasi-experimental designs. And this is really important to try to establish evidence for causation. Cross-sectional designs where all the data was collected at a single point in time were excluded because it's very difficult to determine causality from those cross-sectional designs. As an example, it's been known for decades that marriage is associated with greater levels of happiness. But is that because marriage brings about happiness? Or is it because happy people are more likely to go on to get married? There is, in fact, evidence for both, but from cross-sectional data, we really can't tell. Likewise, religious service attendance is associated with lower levels of depression. But is that because service attendance protects against depression? Or is it because those who are depressed withdraw from religious communities and other forms of community life? Again, I think good evidence for both, but with cross-sectional data, we just can't tell. So in many cases, that restriction to these more rigorous designs excluded the vast majority of the literature. If one looks at religion and happiness, for example, the time this review was conducted in 2017, I could only find one out of more than 100 studies that had that longitudinal design. There have been several others since, but this diagram here kind of summarizes the evidence was able to find as of 2017. The 4 institutional pathways are on the left, and then the 5 flourishing domains on the right, and these numbers here correspond to references in the paper providing evidence from one of those more rigorous studies for the relevant effects. In many cases, the evidence was already quite substantial in 2017. In other cases, just 1 or 2 studies really constituted the whole of the evidence base. But again, that has expanded considerably since then, with yet further support for these institutional pathways. I do think this has various policy implications. We could again spend a whole lecture on what those might be, but just as one example, I think taking a lens of flourishing rather than just, say, restricting ourselves to health and money may lead to quite different policy recommendations. I think many welfare policies, for example, are well-intentioned and provide necessary health care and sustenance, which is really important for those struggling. But if one expands one's lens to look at the whole of flourishing, I think it becomes clear that it's absolutely critical that we design welfare policies in ways which don't disincentivize work. Because while work, sure, it does provide often in this country the healthcare access and income needed for sustenance, it does more than that. It provides people a sense of meaning and purpose. It's often a forum for relationships. It's a way people can use their character strengths. And by disincentivizing work, we're not allowing for these other forms of flourishing. So I think, for example, supportive employment programs for those who are disadvantaged or mentally ill, which help people find long-term employment, been shown to be effective in randomized trials. I think these sorts of approaches and activities are quite important so as to fully make use of all that work brings to enhancing our flourishing. I think similar policy implications for these other institutional pathways, eliminating welfare penalties in the marriage penalties in the welfare system, that when people marry, they lose their benefits, discouraging marriage. I think allowing for school choice to pursue a variety of different flourishing outcomes is important. I think preserving religious liberty and correcting unbalanced media portrayals of religion is important to encourage these pathways. And again, I simply think expanding the range of outcomes we're considering when we're thinking about policy really is important if we want to try to bring about a flourishing society. I am going to spend a little bit more time on this final point on religion, on religious communities, and I'll go in a little bit more detail into some of the evidence there and some of what I see, as well as the policy implications of the research and of religious communities being an important pathway. And that will kind of bring me to my final points on notions of flourishing versus well-being and notions of Christian spiritual well-being or flourishing. So large body of evidence has now accumulated in the literature supporting an effect of religious participations, especially participation in religious community, church service attendance on a host of different well-being outcomes. I had the pleasure of joining Harold Koenig, who's led this handbook of religion and health for the last couple of decades, summarizing all of the evidence, over 10,000 studies on this topic. In this third edition, we really restricted attention or focused attention on the most rigorous studies, but there are various other systematic reviews and studies using multiple cohort data supporting the same sorts of conclusions, that participation in religious community, weekly church attendance, is associated over time, often over 10, 15, 20 years, with a host of outcomes. Lower risk of all-cause mortality, possibly extending longevity up to 7 years. About 30% lower rates of depression. Higher levels of life satisfaction. 50 to 80% reductions in suicide, higher levels of meaning and purpose, less substance abuse, less crime, greater levels of generosity, volunteering, civic engagement, pro-social behaviors, better social relationships, greater marital stability. So quite a list of outcomes. Perhaps not everything. There's still kind of dispute over the effects on cardiovascular health. Possibly some evidence that attending religious services increases rather than decreases body mass index. Perhaps the big church potlucks with the fried chicken aren't the best there. But again, reducing all-cause mortality. Interestingly, the effects on anxiety are not especially clear. May be present, but much smaller than on depression or suicide, for example. But again, effects on a host of important outcomes. So, what should we do with this sort of data? Well, I don't think it's appropriate to say this data implies everyone should be going to religious services. I think that really risks the danger of instrumentalizing religion, and people become religious not principally for physical health reasons, but out of their experiences, the truth claims that are being made that provide systems of meaning, the values that are present. But I think in many ways, for the large portion of the population that do hold religious beliefs, but that may not attend, in fact, these well-being benefits and the spiritual nature of what's taking place at church services or religious communities are consonant with one another. And so I think it can be difficult questions, but important questions with regard to whether it's ever appropriate to intervene. And so I'm going to turn briefly to these questions in my own set of disciplines, public health and medicine, and how they might play out there. And the topic of spirituality and medicine and health has been a controversial one in the literature, but increasingly its role has been recognized. Palliative care guidelines are now to inquire about spirituality in the context of end-of-life treatment, even though this is still rarely done. Patients really value this. In one study of cancer patients, patients rated religion and spirituality as the second most important factor out of 7 in their own health decision-making. Physicians rated it 7th out of 7. So a real discrepancy in terms of what patients desire and what clinicians are providing. Similar sets of considerations in psychiatric care as well, where a recent statement was put forward by the American Psychiatric Association concerning the importance of addressing these matters within psychiatry as well. There are various spiritual history assessments that have been put forward. At least in this country, people often complain they're too long. 4 questions is too much on spirituality. We've made an attempt to reduce these to just 2. Are religion or spirituality important to you in thinking about health or illness, or at other times do you have or would you like to have someone to talk to about spiritual matters? These questions are fairly neutral, can be asked even if the clinician and the patient don't share similar beliefs or views. Referrals can be made as appropriate. So I think kind of looking at this literature while kind of recognizing some of the challenges, a reasonable way to approach these issues while recognizing that people won't have the same views on all of these matters, and while not trying to provide any sort of universal prescription for religious service attendance, would be to start with this sort of spiritual history. For patients who do indicate that they are spiritual or religious, inquiries could be made as to whether they have a religious community, and if not, encouragement could be provided to join one. This is not saying you should become religious because of the health benefits. It's saying you already hold these beliefs. Why not join a community because of these benefits, and because this is what the teaching of these churches or religious communities themselves are. For those who aren't religious, encouragement to other forms of community participation could be made. For those who have had negative experiences in church or religious communities, abuse perhaps even, referrals could be made to chaplains or counselors to try to address these matters. So I think proceeding in this way, which is more nuanced than just sort of some type of universal prescription for religious service attendance, is a way to encourage participation while respecting the diversity of beliefs and experiences in the general population. And so, again, I do think this is a reasonable way to try to handle what are sometimes very challenging matters. I think we can also turn the question around and ask, given the size of these effects across so many important outcomes, are we doing harm by withholding this information? So I do think this is an area where the research really suggests a sensible way forward, that can help promote both individual flourishing, but also the flourishing of churches and other religious communities. So with that, I want to kind of take a step yet further back and return to the questions of what do we mean by flourishing and well-being, and also how might we approach this from a distinctively Christian perspective. As I mentioned earlier, in much of my speech and writing, I will use the terms flourishing and well-being interchangeably, as many others do. But I do think there are subtle differences and connotations between well-being and flourishing, or thriving, which is often used as well. Thriving, almost suggests doing well in spite of the context and the environment, whereas I think flourishing suggests a certain consonance with the environment and the context, that it's supporting the growth, the blossoming, the flowering of the individual. And so when trying to be precise with regard to definitions, our original definition for flourishing was of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. I think that can be given a bit further nuance, where it would define well-being as the relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good as they pertain to that individual. Whereas flourishing is the relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including the contexts and communities in which that person lives. So this is getting at the notion that there should be a certain consonance between the environment, between the communities and the context, and the individual's flourishing. It also kind of captures the notion of a common good, that the community's well-being is part of one's own flourishing. So one might say that someone who is doing well in a corrupt context has achieved or attained some level of well-being, but they're not fully flourishing because the community around them is not doing well, is not good. I think it also touches on notions of how suffering can be compatible with flourishing. If one is suffering to enable the well-being of the community, that itself is part of one's own flourishing. How to take these matters into account empirically is more complicated. One can look at kind of the different determinants of flourishing within a community, not just how the individual is doing, but what are the economic structures or the governance structures like? How is culture developing within a community? And that, in some sense, each of these is also part of an individual's flourishing. So as a crude first pass at this, in collaboration with Dennis Snower and others at the University of Oxford, we're trying to take Dennis Snower's SAGE framework and actually map it to the global flourishing study data. So he's developed what he calls his SAGE framework, looking at communal, constitutive, and determinative elements of flourishing. So looking at things like solidarity, agency, the economic system, economic gain, and the environment itself as important determinants of individual level well-being as part of that communal well-being, that communal flourishing. So we'll be kind of mapping this to our global flourishing study data to try to better uncover the relations between these communal aspects of well-being and individual flourishing. Finally taking a step out yet further, in some sense bringing God into the picture, thinking about distinctively Christian notions of well-being, I want to make a few further definitional distinctions. In much of our work at the Human Flourishing Program, we have focused on distinctively Christian aspects of well-being, but in much of our work we have not. And we have intentionally tried to look at notions of flourishing and well-being that might be applicable across countries, across contexts, in hope of attaining a broader consensus around well-being. Almost everyone says, yes, health is important, yes, financial status is important, and I think those things are important, but I think we can have a broader consensus. I think we can have a consensus across cultures on things like happiness and meaning in life and relationships and character. So much of our work has focused on a pluralistic notion of flourishing that is applicable across contexts. But as I said earlier, I don't think flourishing is reducible to those domains. And I think any well-developed notion of flourishing will be much richer. And I think a distinctively Christian well-being, notion of well-being or flourishing will be much richer, as indeed was the case in Bill Hathaway's talk. And so in some of the kind of initial theorizing around this, well, I would still maintain a reasonable definition of flourishing as a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. There's a lot buried in there. What are all aspects of life? Is there a spirituality? And what is good? And those notions are going to differ across traditions. So while would still retain that as a definition of flourishing, I think one can also provide further nuance by thinking about eternal flourishing, spiritual well-being, temporal flourishing. So I would define eternal flourishing as that complete communion with God that brings about full flourishing, a perfect happiness. Temporal flourishing is then a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good as pertaining to the goods in this life. And there, again, I think we can have a fairly broad consensus with many people who might not share a distinctively Christian perspective. And then finally, in thinking about this life, would define spiritual well-being as a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good with respect to his or her final end in God. Not that we've achieved that, not that we've attained that, but that's what we're trying to do. And so that's what we ought to prioritize as Christians in this life, that pursuit of spiritual well-being that will eventually bring us to eternal flourishing. So there's kind of more conceptual and what I see as perhaps causal relations between these different notions of flourishing in that paper published by Baylor, book chapter published by Baylor University Press. But I think often, in many cases, the spiritual well-being and temporal flourishing will be consonant with one another. Activities that support one will support the other as well. I think spiritual well-being will often be causally beneficial for temporal flourishing as well, as the work on religious service attendance and well-being does indeed indicate. But I think sometimes they do come into conflict. Sometimes we are persecuted for faith. Sometimes we need to make sacrifices, lower our well-being, as Bill pointed out, also for the purpose of a greater end, a greater spiritual goal. When the two do come in conflict, again, spiritual well-being for the Christian is to be prioritized, which may lead to lower flourishing scores on the index here and now. It doesn't mean we're flourishing less, it just means these other aspects of well-being, of flourishing, aren't being captured by that index. But as Bill also pointed out, that suffering itself can often be a source of growth, of transformation, and of further spiritual well-being. So in September, I have a book coming out on theology of health, wholeness, and human flourishing, where I kind of unpack some of my own thinking from more of a distinctively theological rather than empirical perspective on these matters further. And we're trying to do measure development correspondingly, looking at communal notions of well-being, not just individual well-being, looking at notions of spiritual well-being, trying to develop assessments of the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, and also beginning to incorporate other non-Western perspectives and specific population. Adolescents, we have a measure of flourishing for 12 to 18-year-olds based on similar domains but different items. And we've also just recently released an assessment on end of life, flourishing at the end of life, with, again, a stage-appropriate modification of those prior items. So in conclusion, I think flourishing is a concept that pertains to the whole of life, something we should be pursuing and are pursuing as individuals and should be as a community. I think we should be embedding much richer set of outcomes into most of our studies, looking at this whole range of flourishing outcomes, not just health and money, but also meaning, happiness, character, relationships. I think government should start tracking these flourishing measures. I think employers, medical centers, schools, universities could try to track flourishing over time and to try to improve it. I truly believe that what we measure shapes what we discuss, what we know, what we aim for, and the policies put in place to achieve it. I think by talking about flourishing and focusing on flourishing more, both in our discussions and in our assessments, we'll be better able to attain it both individually and as a community. Thank you all for listening, and happy to take a few questions.
I know that some of us might have questions. You could raise your hands and I'll pass on the mic. Questions or comments? Okay.
Your last comment there about organizations using this research to be able to measure their own system or community. I just want to clarify. So would you encourage churches or church leaders to take these 10 questions and survey their congregants to be able to measure flourishing over time?
Yes, that's what I would suggest. Not just looking at those 12 questions. Again, notions of spiritual well-being are much richer, but yes, use these 12 questions. And indeed, Jeff Frey at GLUE has been doing this pretty extensively, and
Yes.
Caitlin Long there in the back from the Human Flourishing Program is launching an effort to try to do this at scale and in ways that can help and empower congregations.
Awesome, thanks.
I just wanted to mention Laura, she's from the Church Mental Health Summit. She does this annual summit.
Hi, I'm Steve Perry. I'm in communication discipline. Interested in work being part of this and thinking about that and relationships. And one of the things that we talk about, for example, is that people won't die saying, "I just wish I'd worked more." They'll wish they'd spent more time in a relationship. However, we're entering a period where the AI robots they say will take over a lot of our work. And so when we look into the future, we look at a period where humans may not be able to keep up and compete with robots for work, and therefore we'll all be spending a lot of time in a relationship. What's the balance between these things, and how do you measure that? I guess do you get at some kind of balance between these?
I mean, I do think some recalibration in this country would be good. I think we do work too much, and if you compare our working hours to that of Europe, we have considerably more working hours and score more poorly on relationships. So I think some recalibration, including in my own life, would be beneficial. But I do think the questions around work and technology and AI are more complicated. I think we need to anticipate these in advance, both with regard to what is this doing to the economic distribution within society, and are these technologies concentrating all wealth with just too few individuals so as to not allow society to flourish? So I think there are complicated questions on how do we handle those challenges, and also complicated questions around the nature of work. I think even if we do a recalibration, we spend more time with our relationships, which I think we should, I still think work is an important and meaningful pathway to flourishing, and I think it's there in the creation narratives as well. Before the fall, there was work. God put them in the garden to tend and keep it, and so I think even if we did arrive at this utopian state where all of our work was being done by AI bots, and we found a way to have reasonably good standard of living for the whole of society, we would still want some form of quote-unquote work. Now, maybe that would be more like gardening, an orientation towards what's beautiful, towards creating beauty. But I do think meaningful activity to create or produce something is an important part of our flourishing, an important pathway, an important part of who we are as human persons. So I don't want to pretend the answers to any of these questions are easy, but in kind of broad outline, that's how I see things ideally proceeding.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. VanderWeele. I was wondering, kind of when getting back to the well-being versus flourishing and how the flourishing has a community component to it, and whereas the individual, they're two separate categories as you define them, but then you did talk about when at times you have to forsake your own individual flourishing for the sake of a community flourishing, or individual well-being, for community. But I'm wondering, what should we as, Christian thinkers and psychologists and scientists be thinking about, as well-being in just the individual component as a worthwhile construct to assess?
Yeah, so again, I do think those domains of flourishing, which I believe are arguably common and shared across cultures, are relevant for a Christian perspective as well. I don't think any of them are irrelevant. We may have to make sacrifices in certain of those domains, but I think any suffering, even from a Christian perspective, does indicate some absence of flourishing. And I think the nature of our fallen world is such that there is no way to attain perfect flourishing in this life. But I do think those domains are relevant. What one would then want to supplement that with are richer notions of spiritual well-being and richer assessments of spiritual well-being. Some of that may have to do with kind of objective activities and time spent in prayer or at church services and so on, but some of it may be more along the lines of what we've been trying to do in terms of assessing faith, hope, and love, the central theological virtues that sustain us in the spiritual life. So I think there's more work to be done as to what those assessments really ought to look like and what should be prioritized. But I would say, both the more generic flourishing assessment supplemented by something distinctively Christian would be one reasonable way to proceed. I think we then also want kind of community well-being assessments, and we've, as I said, have been working on those, kind of shaped around domains of community well-being. Not just are the individuals in the community flourishing, but are the relationships good? Mm-hmm. Is there proficient leadership to help guide and inspire the community? Are there structures and practices in place to sustain the life of the community and to resolve conflict? Is there a sense of belonging and welcome? Is there a shared sense of mission? And I think that could be done both with regard to the church, but other organizations as well, like schools and workplaces and so on.
Thank you.
We have a question from Andrew.
Andrew Root from Regent. I teach finance. The two questions. The last domain that's included, questions 11 and 12, on finance and material well-being. Can you talk about some of the discussion or theory as to why that's an independent flourishing outcome variable as opposed to something that's influencing the other domains? And then you cited Snower's SAGE framework. Is that an appropriate motivational framework for future research in that area, or would you recommend something else that would supplement it?
Yeah, so I'll go through those questions in turn. With regard to the first on the financial and material stability questions, there's sort of debate in the literature. People take different perspectives. Are these determinants of well-being, or are these constitutive parts of well-being itself? My own view is if you're going to really define well-being as what pertains to the individual, that a case could kind of be made either way. I do tend to think of them as determinants. If you're thinking about flourishing as all aspects of a person's life are good, then that includes the determinants as well. So in the definition of flourishing I gave, I would say it's part of flourishing, although they are means. They are critical means to sustain those ends. So I kind of appreciate both sides, and I think it really comes down to how you define these matters. On Dennis Noer's SAGE framework, I don't think this is a perfectly adequate way to capture the kind of communal level determinants or components of flourishing. It is one framework capturing several important aspects that we are often otherwise missing. It's one which he's operationalized and has connected it to Gallup World Poll data and other sources. So it's one we can fairly easily import into the global flourishing study, for example, but I in no way think of this as kind of the ultimate theoretical framing. And I think he would say the same, in fact. His view is that if he takes something to governments, and he's quite involved in sort of G20 discussions, that people can remember 4 things, but no more. And some of his economist colleagues disagree with him and say only one, and they advocate just for looking at life satisfaction, because if you're going to displace GDP, you should only have one thing, and so we should only have one variable. Again, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. Some of it is practical, and so I think from a practical perspective, he's identified 4 components, which he thinks is the most he can get through and communicate. And I think 4 reasonably good ones, but I would in no way view this as kind of a perfectly adequate conceptual framing.
I think we just have 2 more questions, and we'll move to the panel. We'll take about 2 minutes break, and 3 more. And then maybe just a minute each, and we'll get to the panel.
Okay, thank you so much for your time and intriguing conversation. 2 quick questions, I guess. One is RS has been talked as an important correlate of flourishing, yet with the 12 questions listed earlier, I noticed that was notably absent. So I was wondering if those questions would get expanded. Second question would be talked about church attendance itself is a very important determinant of flourishing. I'm wondering if it's the attendance itself or it's the quality of relationships within the congregation, and if there would be a separate construct to measure quality of relationships within a religious community.
Yeah. So on the first one, should there have been questions around religion and spirituality in the 12 flourishing questions? My perspective when putting this together was that I really wanted an assessment that was applicable across contexts. And I think there are 2 issues with trying to embed religion and spirituality there. First, I think any adequate assessment really needs to be shaped by the individual religion or tradition. What's considered spiritual well-being and Christian understanding is very different than a Buddhist or Muslim understanding. So kind of to do this well, we would need tradition-specific assessments. And again, some of our work is trying to push for that and say we should be collecting this at national levels, even within a pluralistic society, to understand how these religious communities see themselves as doing. But to try to kind of empty out the most distinctive and most important content of these religions just didn't seem the right way forward. I mean, I think a counter case could be made that something is better than nothing, but that was the thinking by not having that present. The other challenge is that you do have people who identify as atheist or agnostic, which just say this category is totally irrelevant for me, which makes, again, it difficult for universal use. On the relationship question, I do think the quality of relationships in community does come into play. It's more difficult to assess that, but I think some indication of that is given by the fact that you see larger effects on health and well-being for women than for men. You see larger effects in the Black communities in America than the white communities. Beneficial for everyone, but larger in effects for these groups. What's going on? Maybe some of it has to do with psychological processes and complexities, but I think a lot of it is just what does attending a religious service once a week mean? I think for women, they're often there more, longer period of time, deeper relationships than with men who might just show up and leave after the service is done. Likewise, I think there are considerable contrasts between Black and white church communities in this country where, again, in many white communities, it might be 2 or 3 hours. or maybe just 1 hour, and with Black communities, it can sometimes be an all-day affair. And I think that's getting at the depth, the richness of the community and of the relationship. So I think we have some indirect evidence that that's probably so.
Yeah, thank you so much for what you've shared today. I am curious about that one study you're talking about that speaks of all the benefits of being in the church and the church community and all, with the fellow who had worked on this for some time. I'm curious, in lieu of some of the pushback or the drive for religious trauma studies, if any of that came up in the discussion or encountering, or if there's been a shift in its overall value and compare it previously to where it is now with a lot of the discussion around religious trauma.
Yeah, I mean, certainly those who don't like the results will point to religious trauma, will point to abuse within religious communities, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. That has been real. That has been, I think, had devastating effects on many parts of the church community. I think we're in need of reform, of justice, of addressing these matters. So I think that is important. What the data suggests is that averaging across all experiences, including those which are really terrible, which are really traumatic, the average effect is still profoundly beneficial. That doesn't mean beneficial for everyone. Clearly, those who have experienced abuse, it can be quite devastating. But including those people in the studies and averaging over everyone, on average, are getting very substantial positive effects across a wide range of outcomes. And so I think we need to, yes, acknowledge the abuse scandals and address them and take them seriously, but also provide the other side of the story. And to do this in powerful, compelling ways within the media. I think the media and the academy is strongly, strongly biased against religion. And we need to acknowledge the faults that have taken place, but we also need to point to the profound contributions and benefits, and I don't think we've been doing that well enough.
Thank you. I know that Brandon wants to ask a question, and while he's doing that, we can get the panel all set while we, Brendan?
Okay, great. Tyler, it was great to see the thread running through all of this work, and I've really enjoyed using the flourishing measure in my own research. A couple of questions, one about self-report and the other one about, say, the common good. So the self-report question is, if I can think of having my family assess my state of flourishing, they might have better insights into it than I would. And so, there are a lot of situations in which people who are close to us might have a better sense of how we're actually doing. So I wonder if there might be supplementary measures that rely on something like a 360 assessment of one's flourishing that could be more accurate or helpful. The other question is about the common good, and this is sort of a common critique of positive psychology, which I like to call the happy Nazi problem, which is you can run these measures through Nazi society and you could get high rates of flourishing and so on. And I suppose one way to address it is to have a community dimension to the flourishing measure. But what if the community is quite removed, quite distant, right? And so everyone in your own vicinity might be doing fine, but it's all extractive, right? It relies on your flourishing is exploitative of some other children in some other country who are mining lithium for your cell phone batteries, et cetera, right? So then flourishing is an intrinsically normative, positive concept. And one could say that maybe those people have high levels of well-being, but to call it flourishing, given the justice issue, becomes a challenge. So I wonder how you might respond to that.
Yeah, sure. So on the first and arguably easier question, I do think other informants and multiple informants on flourishing is a good idea if one can pull it off. I do think you get richer data, as you said, sometimes more accurate. Though even things like character assessments where you might think that that self-report nature and self-report biases and self-deception biases and social desirability biases may come into play. Other report and self-report are still reasonably well correlated in the domain where you might think it's the worst, but I do think you're getting more information. Our measure was designed so that it could be easily embedded in just about any cohort study or survey or sample. So the multiple informants, other informants takes a lot more work, but when it can be done, I'm fully in favor. With regard to the common good, I think the point you raise is an important one, and I would say flourishing as being in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including the context and communities in which one lives, would pertain not just to one's neighborhood as a community, but to one's city, to one's state, to one's nation, and ultimately globally. I think we are interconnected in a way that any suffering in the world is, in fact, part of our own lack of flourishing. So if we are, if we as a society are riding upon the suffering of others, that is itself a lack of flourishing. So how to operationalize that is another matter, but I think conceptually, notions of the common good pertain not just to one community, but to multiple and concentric communities as well.
Thank you. Tyler VanderWeele. Thank you.